Looking down at the earth from above, it was covered with red dots, an angry march of thousands of king insects. They are as huge as mountains and as raging as tides. The shells were invulnerable, and everything shattered when they hit. Humans are the target of their attacks, and ordinary guns naturally can't resist them, but people sacrificed the giant god soldiers who destroyed the world 1,000 years ago. It burned the wilderness to purgatory with a single shot. But can the king worm really be killed? Hello everyone, today we will continue to cover the second half of the Valley of the Wind. The first part is about 1,000 years after the destruction of the world is ruled by two terrible disasters. One is a huge and terrible bug. The other is the highly toxic forest, which people call the rotten sea. But what is really poisonous is the soil. The rotten sea has been purifying the land, and the insects have been protecting it. As for the initiator of the polluted soil, it was humans 1,000 years ago. So in fact, the rotten sea and the insects are the righteous side, and human beings are self-inflicted. But people did not accept it, and many people decided to go against the grain, and there are two countries in the world that are at war. One is the powerful invading nation, Doromecia, and the other is what I call the counterattacking nation, Pejit, the four princesses of the recently invaded country, Kushana. Grab a strange giant sarcoma, which is the giant god soldier who destroyed the world 1,000 years ago. At present, she is still in the embryonic form and will have the power to destroy the world, and she hopes to regain the earth with the help of the giant god soldier to burn the rotten sea and kill all the insects. The heroine, Nausicaä, is a princess of another small country, the Valley of the Winds, who recently met a pilot from the Strike Nation country. After going through life and death with him, he found out the truth of the world. In fact, this young man is not only a pilot but also a prince of the counterattack country. Today, he took Nausicaä to his country and wanted to show her, but when the two of them flew close to the city, a cloud of black smoke appeared in front of him. The ground was full of dead insects, and the most dead insects at the city gate were the warships and chariots of the invading nation. It seems that they fought to the death with the insects and were eventually overwhelmed by the sea of insects, and even the city's landmark buildings were destroyed by the dead king insects. The prince was saddened by the tragedy and said that the cost of annihilating the invading army was too great. This is a bit informative, but in fact, the plot has been mentioned from various angles before. The aggressor country has already captured the counterattacking country with its strong military strength and garrisoned it to suppress it, and recently the counterattacking country has deliberately driven the tiger and the wolf. Luring the swarm to your own country eliminated the invading country's garrison, but at the cost of ruining your own buildings. The prince said that the price was too great, and the prince was grieving that the giant transport ship of the counterattack country had come down. The lead man admits that he deliberately lured the bugs here, and is happy with the results. After all, as long as the homeland can be recaptured, the damage to the buildings is nothing, and I noticed that the transport ship was crowded with old and weak women and children. It may be that he evacuated his own people before the worms were introduced, and he was ready to continue to use the swarm as a weapon. Take back the Titan soldiers from the West Princess, and since the four princesses are now in the Valley of the Wind, he is ready to destroy the Valley of the Wind together. Of course, this would kill innocent Valley people, but he felt that it was a necessary sacrifice to save the world. Now that the Sea of Worms has rushed to the Valley of the Wind, it is too late to stop it, and Nausicaä is kind by nature, and the Valley of the Wind is her hometown. She was indignant but was subdued, and the prince failed to pull out his gun to save her. The soldiers put her in a transport ship and took her away, and all the men of the country were soldiers. But the women were still on Nausicaä's side, and they cooperated with the prince to deliberately keep the girl in the cell. Jean Nausicaä escaped in her clothes, but the invading ships suddenly attacked. It first used a move, Mount Tai, to overpower, and sent the infantry to the counterattacking warship to start a white-knuckle battle. After that, he chased Nausicaä very hard, but fortunately it was close to the Valley of the Wind. Some villagers learned of the situation and drove a gunboat to help, and we have seen the first half of the plot to know that it is the tradition of this film to be small and big. So this time, the small gunboat took out the big fighter again, but the invading infantry was still in the counterattacking ship. Just as he was about to break down the door and slaughter the old and the young, don't worry, there was still a person sitting in the back seat of the gunboat. He was Nausicaa's swordsmanship teacher. He was a well-known swordsman. He fell from the sky and single-handedly leveled all the enemies. Nausicaä was finally relieved that she was going back to the Valley of the Wind. Warning everyone that the Sea of Insects is coming. In the first half of the plot, the four princesses lead the invading army to occupy the Valley of the Wind with strong armor and artillery. And the construction of a laboratory on the spot began to give birth to the Titan soldier embryo, and recently the farmers of the Valley of the Wind have begun to revolt. The reason for this is that the transport ships of the invading country bring highly toxic spores, which emit air to pollute the surrounding forests. Anyone else would die, and the peasants demanded back farm tools and flamethrowers from the invaders in an attempt to destroy the spores. However, it was too late for the entire forest to be saved, and it had protected the Valley of the Wind for more than 100 years. Now they have been killed by the invading country, and the peasants are furious, and it is just as farm tools and flamethrowers can also be used as weapons. They rebelled and even snatched the rifles and tanks of the invading country, but in general the invading country still had the advantage of forces. The peasants fought and retreated, using a pre-apocalyptic spaceship as a stronghold, and the two sides held out until Nausicaa finally arrived in the evening. But when she saw the ground clearly, all she saw was a vast expanse of red and black, black for the king insects, and red for their angry eyes. Tens of thousands of them are heading towards the Valley of the Wind. What makes them so crazy? Nausicaa saw a bright spot in front of her, which seemed to be the bane, and she hastened to catch up, filled with righteous indignation. The two pilots of the counter nation actually used their aircraft to hang a kingworm larvae, and they deliberately abused it to bleed to provoke the kingworm to chase after it, and it seems that they used this method to drive the tiger and devour the wolf before. Nausicaa switched to a glider and tried to persuade the pilot to give up, but she shot her in the foot but was prevented from falling by the lake. After escaping, the larvae tried to cross the lake to meet the king bug army, but its wounds gushed with bodily fluids and soaked in the poisonous lake water, and it died. Nausicaa used her body to prevent her skirt from being stained with larval bodily fluids, and her injured foot retreated into the lake. The burning pain caused her to shrink to the ground, and the larva was awakened by the screams, and her eyes finally turned blue. Stretching out her golden tentacles, Nausicaa thought that the crisis was finally over. Unexpectedly, the army of king insects was dizzy, and although the larvae were safe, they were still angry and continued to kill the Valley of the Wind. The invading nation and the peasants of the Valley of the Wind have temporarily ceased fighting and opened fire, but this will only further anger the kingworm. The two pilots of the counterattack country couldn't help but laugh at the fact that it was really self-defeating, but they turned their heads stupidly as soon as their laughter fell. Nausicaa threatens them with a cannon that they must fly the aircraft and send herself and the larvae into the swarm. The bullet is justice, and the two have to obey, and they are working hard at this time. The soldiers of the invading country have realized that the artillery fire is ineffective against the insect swarm and begin to flee, but the figure of the fourth princess appears on the mountain. She actually woke up the giant god soldier to fight. This kind of demon that once destroyed the world is the only hope that can punish the kingworm. The deserters cheered again, but they didn't know that the giant god soldiers were far from immature and their bodies were in a fluid state. Some parts had already begun to rot, and the fourth princess urged it to send out a shot, although it was not successful. But the explosion wave within a radius of several kilometers died the night into day. No wonder the world could be burned to ashes by them 1,000 years ago. But the kingworm in front had just burned to death, and the back was made up, and the four princesses urged the giant god soldiers to do it. But this time it was so rotten that it barely managed to squeeze out a trace of energy, and it bled its flesh and blood and died. As the swarm drew closer and the people gave up their resistance, Nausicaa finally flew to everyone's side. She lowered herself and the larvae to death in front of the swarm, and the swarm did not slow down in the slightest, knocking her into the sky and falling to the ground to continue to rush wildly. The spaceship guarded by the villagers was a pre-apocalyptic black technology that was not pierced by the kingworm. But from the sky, the red swarm has spread all over the peninsula, and people are doomed. However, why did a blue patch appear in the center of the swarm, and it gradually spread, and after a while, the entire swarm stopped attacking? They collectively formed a circle, and the center of the circle was Nausicaä, and it seemed that she had sacrificed her life to finally awaken the nature of the kingworm. The villagers couldn't help crying, and one worm was silent, stretching out countless golden tentacles to hold her to the sky. Looking up at the sky from the ground, the sky turns golden, and the tentacles contain life force to heal Nausicaa's wounds and give her a new life. It seems that her righteousness has affected Wangworm's heart. The tentacles of the kingworm look soft, and Nausicaä walks on it as if walking on a golden step. An old woman in the Valley of the Wind couldn't help but be stunned. She remembered the old legend. It is said that a man in a long blue dress will come to the golden grassland and lead nature back to cleanliness. It turns out that everything is true, and here we notice that Nausicaä was originally wearing a bizarre pink dress. It was dyed blue by its own bodily fluids while rescuing the larvae. Perhaps the legend had foreseen it. The world can only be reborn if humans and insects suffer together. As the breeze picked up, Nausicaä returned to the surface and was heroically welcomed by the villagers, and the kingworm slowly moved back into the woods. There were too many of them, and it would take more than a day, and the fourth princess returned home with reinforcements and gave up the invasion for the time being. After the disaster, the villagers began to rebuild, and the story of Valley of the Wind has come to an end. But their good life will continue. Okay, that's all for today's show. Welcome to Pay Attention. We'll see you next time.